Welcome back to the Dershow. I'm going to switch today from Ukraine. I think I'll answer some questions about Ukraine at the end of the show, but right now I want to focus on a problem we're having in America. It's part of the trend toward the new McCarthyism by the left, but this one is being done by lawyers, some of them quite distinguished lawyers. They've put together a group of lawyers, more than 100 of them, and they're calling themselves the 65 Project. What's the 65 Project? It's named after the 65 law cases and briefs that were filed on behalf of former President Trump to try to undo the election. As you know where I stand, I think the election was generally fair in Pennsylvania, acted unconstitutionally, but it wouldn't have changed the election. I think Biden is our legitimate president. I would not personally, as a lawyer, participate in trying to challenge an election that was fair, though I did participate in challenging the election of George W. Bush when Al Gore challenged the counting of the vote. I was one of the lawyers who represented the people from Palm Beach County who voted in the butterfly ballot and ended up voting for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore, although they intended to vote for Al Gore. But I don't agree with the lawyers who did that. But these lawyers are now being subject to attack. A group has gotten together. And the purpose of the group, and I'll read you from what they themselves say, this is mostly important for the deterrent effect it can bring so you can kill the pool of legal talent going forward. In other words, they want to make sure that no lawyers in the future do what these lawyers did in the past. One of the leaders said the purpose was to, quote, shame them and make them toxic in their communities and in their firms. And he's not going after the big lawyers. What he says is the little fish, the individual lawyers, the lawyers who just barely are making it through, the little fish are probably more vulnerable to what we are doing, threatening their livelihood and their reputation in their communities. Now, if this sounds familiar to anybody who's my age, it's understandable why it's familiar. It's exactly what happened during the 1950s when law groups, including some bar associations, went after lawyers who had the gall to represent people accused of communism. Some of them were communists, some of them were not communists. Didn't matter. Everybody's entitled to a defense. And the lawyers who represented people accused of communism, people went after them. Bar associations, universities, Harvard Law School, the Law Review refused to allow a person who had been summoned by the House Un-American Activities to serve on the Law Review. There were a lot of people who went along with this. And so during McCarthyism, some lawyers went after other lawyers because they disagreed with what they were doing in terms of filing briefs. That's not the only time that's happened in American history. I also remember what happened in the 1960s. I went down south during the 1960s. I worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in order to try to help dismantle segregation. Southern law groups, Southern lawyers went after lawyers from the North, civil rights lawyers, and lawyers from the South, civil rights lawyers from the South, went after them and tried to get them disciplined and disbarred and shamed in their communities and tried to destroy their right to practice law. And so we've seen this before, but this is the first time we've seen it from the left. And what's most disturbing about this 65 Project is it includes some decent lawyers, and I understand their motivations. They may even in some ways be well-intentioned, but what they're doing is so dangerous. It's so un-American. It's so undemocratic with a small d. It simply says to lawyers, we're going to judge you by your clients. If we don't like your clients, we're coming after you. Now, lawyers tend to be overzealous, and certainly there are some lawyers who may have gone too far. I have no doubt about that. But that's what courts are there to decide. If somebody files a lawsuit that's legally frivolous, that has no basis whatsoever in law of fact, lawyers can be disciplined. They can be sanctioned. They can be made to pay the legal fees. In extreme cases, they can even be suspended, or in extraordinary cases, disbarred. Courts can do that. Bar associations can do it. They don't need a McCarthyite committee of Project 65 to help the legal system cope with these briefs. the object of this McCarthyite tactic is simply to prevent lawyers, to chill lawyers, particularly young lawyers and lawyers who aren't established, from taking on controversial cases, which those in power, and today in the bar, the left is in power in many ways, uh, by alienating people like that, you risk your bar certificate, you risk your right to practice law, you risk your living, and it's just scary. And the fact that it's accepted and so few lawyers are willing to stand up to it. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not one of the lawyers under attack. I did, as you know, defend President Trump in front of the United States Senate against what I believed and still believe was an unconstitutional impeachment, but I didn't defend him in the attempt to overturn the election. I did that quite deliberately because I didn't believe in myself that there was a plausible legal argument for overturning the election. So I'm not one of the lawyers who people are, this committee is going after, but that's not a reason for me to be silent. I'm not going to remain silent. I hereby, and you can take this to the bank, agree pro bono to represent any lawyer who is a target of this Project 65 group, and I will defend them. I will defend them on First Amendment grounds. To paraphrase Voltaire, I may disagree, and I do disagree, with what they said and what they did, but I will defend zealously their right to say it, and I will defend them against a McCarthyite committee, which is coming after them based on briefs that they filed. Look, think about it this way. We want people to file legal briefs if they're challenging an election. We don't want January 6th to be the response by people who are concerned about the election. We much prefer for lawyers to go to court and to argue under the rule of law for a result they want. They lost all their cases. Look, I lost also in 2000 when I defended the people of Palm Beach County and tried to argue that the election that resulted in President Bush being sworn in was an improper election, and that the result should have gone to Al Gore. I lost, but nobody came after me. Nobody tried to disbar me or discipline me. I wrote a book about it called Supreme Injustice. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times. People disagreed with my book. In fact, it was reviewed along with another book by a federal judge who took a very different position. Let the public decide. But nobody went after my bar certificate. Nobody went after my ability to earn a living. Nobody tried to get me fired at Harvard today. I'm sure people will try to get people fired, and they will try to get academics fired who participated in this event. So this is very different. We want to encourage the rule of law, and we don't want to do what these folks are trying to do. These folks, as they say in their own words, they're trying to chill, they're trying to encourage, they're trying to kill efforts by lawyers to challenge election results. They're afraid that the election results this year will be challenged, or the election results 2.5 years from now will be challenged. We welcome those challenges. This is the rule of law. Yeah, we welcome those challenges. We don't welcome a repeat of January 6th. We don't welcome people going into the Capitol, although even those people have the right to due process and a fair trial. I'm representing, as you know, one of them, a law student who just trespassed, arguably. He said he was welcomed in by the police, so probably he didn't even trespass, but he didn't do anything else wrong. He wasn't like the guy who was convicted today, who came in with a gun and was convicted of making threats or anything like that. So we have to consider each situation separately on the merits. But in general, given a choice with a country under the rule of law, would you rather lawyers walk into court with briefs saying, here's the Constitution, the 12th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, whatever, it requires that the case be sent back to the states. You know, you can accept that, you can reject that, but it's the rule of law. Would you prefer those lawyers not do that? but instead try to enter the Capitol and try to disrupt, if they did, the proceedings? No, of course not. So why? What is this Project 65 plan to do? And don't they understand that once weaponized, any tactic that is used today by liberal Democrats against Trump conservatives can 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, serve as a precedent for weaponizing it against the other side? Is there no such thing left as kind of neutral shoe on the other foot test rules, where we ask ourselves the question, what if the shoe were on the other foot? What if these were Democrat lawyers who were challenging the election? Over 100 lawyers challenged the election of Al Gore, of Bush over Al Gore. Over 100 of them. They took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. They lost. But nobody would argue that what they did violated the rule of law, violated ethics. Look, it's possible that some lawyers may have stepped over a line. If so, courts can handle that. Bar associations can handle that. We don't need a vigilante committee of McCarthyites singling out these folks and saying, we have these, I don't remember, 111 lawyers that are in our sights, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that they're shamed and they're canceled and they're investigated and possibly disbarred and disciplined and put out of business. We don't need that sort of McCarthyism from the left in America today, and it's part of a big problem. Look what's going on university campuses today. There was a good article in the New York Times yesterday by a student at the University of Virginia. I think she was a sophomore, junior, I don't remember. But she said, everybody's afraid to talk in class. If you're not a progressive, woke, extremist, radical, like many of the professors are, you're afraid. If you speak in class, you'll be shamed, you'll be canceled, you will be downgraded, you will not be recommended, and the administration won't back you up for 1 second, because administrations are known for their cowardice. They put their finger up to the wind, they decide which way the wind's blowing, what's politically correct, and they generally follow through on what is politically correct. So we have McCarthyism on the campuses. We have McCarthyism in the media, where people simply are canceled and not allowed to have access to the media. I had an experience with that with BBC when I was interviewed about the Maxwell case, and a member of parliament said, oh my God, Dershowitz should never be interviewed on these matters because he has been accused. I said I was accused. I wasn't there as an expert. I was there as somebody who was a party participant, and I gave them very useful information that helped people understand the dynamics of what was going on. But the McCarthyites in England said, no, we only want one side of that story to be told. We only want the victims to be told. Now, who's the victim? I'm a victim of a false allegation, but they don't want my side of the story to be told. So we have McCarthyism in the media. We have McCarthyism in universities. We have McCarthyism in so many different places, and now we have McCarthyism at the bar. We have McCarthyism as the result of groups of lawyers, individuals getting together, led by some activist Democrats from an organization called Media Matters, which is a hard left, anti-liberal, pro-progressive, pro-woke organization. Some lawyers who are advising the committee are good people. But, as Louis Brandeis said 100 years ago, the greatest dangers to liberty lurk in people of good intentions, but without understanding. And we live in such a divided world today that you gotta pick sides. And if you're a lawyer who picked the wrong side, who picked Trump's side, we're gonna get you. It doesn't matter whether you did anything illegal or anything unethical or anything. We're gonna get you. We're gonna shame you. We're gonna put you out of business. That's what happened during McCarthyism. Don't they know that? They may not be old enough to remember, but can't they read history? And some of them are old enough to remember, if not McCarthyism, certainly the civil rights movement and the brave lawyers who stood up against segregationist lawyers in the South. And then Bar associations went after them. Groups of lawyers went after them. How dare you challenge our sacred institution of segregation? What you're doing is illegal. You're encouraging sit-ins. Oh my God, we know sit-ins are illegal. And if you're encouraging sit-ins, you're complicit. You're part of the criminality. And so lawyers were investigated. Some were disciplined. Cases had to go to various courts to clear them. And do we really want a repeat of that in 2022? Do we really want to go back to the dark days of McCarthyism, the dark days of segregation, the dark days where lawyers were blamed for their clients? Do we not remember John Adams? I mean, my God, if this committee were in existence back in 1770, 71, whenever the Boston Massacre was, they would probably be investigating John Adams. My God, John Adams putting up a defense for British redcoats who fired into a crowd and killed Crispin Attucks and so many other great American patriots. How dare those lawyers do that? How dare John Adams do that? How dare Abraham Lincoln represent people who were guilty, in some cases who he knew were guilty? There's a very famous case where Abraham Lincoln pulled a fast one. He gave a witness the wrong year's almanac and had him admit that the moon wasn't out that night when he claimed he saw Abe Lincoln's client stab the person. But of course, the moon was out that night, and Lincoln tricked him. This 65 project would be going after Abe Lincoln. It would be going after Thurgood Marshall, would be going after Clarence Darrow, would be going after anybody who they disagreed with, because what's good for the goose, you know? And it's so short-sighted. It's so typical of what's going on in America today. There just doesn't seem to be room in America today for principles, for due process. For due process for me and thee. No, instead it's free speech for me, but not for thee. Due process for me, but not for thee. Fairness for me, but not for thee. The rule of law for me, but not for thee. It was a dictator in one of the South American countries who said, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. And that's what these benighted people, lawyers, are doing. They're gathering together in order to unite and present investigations. And even if it doesn't come to investigations, what they want to do is shame them. They want to publicly humiliate them. They want to threaten potential clients that maybe that'll happen to them too if they use them as lawyers. Well, I have to tell you, I'm not scared. Maybe I'm too old to be frightened, but I'm going to defend these lawyers, and I'm going to defend them vigorously. I'm going to defend them on First Amendment grounds, on Sixth Amendment grounds, on Seventh Amendment grounds, on due process grounds. Everywhere in the Constitution, the rule of law seems to prevail over efforts to try to stop lawyers from presenting arguments. If you don't like the arguments, come up with better arguments. If you don't like what they're saying, come up with something better to say. But don't try to censor anybody, and certainly don't try to stop lawyers from filing briefs. This is not the first time this has happened, even in the last couple of years. When President Trump was impeached, well, he was still president and then put on trial after he left the presidency for his speech that he made on January 6th, a group of very distinguished lawyers, including some very prominent First Amendment activists, threatened Trump's lawyers. I was not one of them at the time, but there were some very good ones. Threatened Trump's lawyers, if you dare to present a First Amendment defense of a president's speech calling for peaceful and patriotic demonstrations, if you dare even to raise the First Amendment, we're going to accuse you of making a frivolous argument. Frivolous arguments are not allowed to be made. And I wrote a piece back then saying I will defend any lawyer who is charged with making a First Amendment argument. I urged them to make the First Amendment argument. They made the First Amendment argument. It prevailed in the Senate. It was right. I supported that First Amendment argument, though I didn't support the president making that speech. And ultimately, no one went after the lawyers, some very distinguished ones, who made those arguments the First Amendment arguments in the Senate. But now it's been a year, a little over a year, and now some of the same people who wrote that letter have now organized to try to get the lawyers who filed briefs on behalf of President Trump. Shame on them. We're not going to let you get away with it. We're going to fight back. And it's not going to be a fight between Trump supporters and anti-Trump supporters. It's going to include people like me, who was not a Trump supporter, who didn't vote for Trump, who voted for Biden, who voted for Clinton. People who don't agree with the arguments that were made by these lawyers, but who fundamentally disagree even more so with efforts to try to silence them, to try to shame them, to try to chill them. Because when you go after them today, you're coming after other people tomorrow. That's how McCarthyism begins. That's how it spreads. And that's why we're going to stop it. We're going to stop it in its tracks, and we're going to restore this country to the rule of law, where lawyers can file briefs if they believe that the arguments they're making are reasonable. If the courts don't accept it, they don't have to accept it. But who gives you the power? You, this committee, this Project 65, gives you the power to decide which arguments can be made and which arguments can't be made. Interested in your views on that. Probably there are three groups of people. There are probably people who think those lawyers were right in filing that brief, that the election was unfair. Okay, I understand that. There are people who think the lawyers were wrong and therefore they should be disciplined. And then there's the group, which I call my group, which doesn't decide what lawyers can do based on whether we agree or disagree with their brief. So I'm interested in hearing from all three groups and see if we can come to some sort of consensus about what the right approach is. Okay, now back to Ukraine. Let me just read you a couple of letters that I got on Ukraine, which were very disturbing. So here's the first one. No, Zelensky's military should be indicted for war crimes. Zelensky's military should be indicted for war crimes? Have they killed a single civilian? The indications are they've killed maybe between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian soldiers. You'd think they have the right to do that to prevent an invasion. So Zelensky's military should be indicted for war crimes, not Putin, not Putin. If you did your actual research, Dersh, believe me, I did, you would know no one is the good guy in this story. And I don't freaking want to hear that stupid defense, well, there was no neo-Nazis in Ukraine because Zelensky is Jewish. That is the stupid statement I've ever heard. Well, first, I haven't made that argument. I don't believe in justice by ethnic identity. Zelensky happens to be a Jew. Remember that every day on his way to work, Zelensky passes a statue of Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky was Hitler's idol. Khmelnytsky murdered hundreds of thousands of Jewish babies and women. He is the national hero of the Ukraine. So the Ukraine has a long history of collaboration with Nazis. In fact, there are even reports today, I haven't confirmed them, but there are reports that in a city called Zhytomyr, there were attacks on Jewish store owners and Jews reminiscent of some of the things that happened in Ukraine many years earlier. But no, I don't see any war crimes that have been committed by Zelensky's military. They seem to be heroically defending their country and trying to prevent mass attacks on civilian targets and the killing of children and women and others. So there was another email much like that. Different person. You are misinformed. It has been a reality since the fall of the USSR. Many neo-Nazis moved to Ukraine and were directly involved in the overthrow of the elected government in 2014. That's a complicated story, 2014. It's a complicated story, but it's not as simple as this guy makes it sound. That was a US NATO-backed coup that mostly relied on these neo-Nazis like Right Sector, Svoboda, Azov, Battalion, etc. these are the neo-Nazis that Putin was talking about. Uh, no, I don't think that's right. Of course, there are neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. There are neo-Nazis in Brooklyn, in Newark, New Jersey. There are neo-Nazis in. I live on the east side of New York. In the 1930s, Yorktown, which is now a prominent upscale area, was dominated by Nazis. 30,000 of them went to Madison Square Garden to praise Hitler before the beginning of the Second World War. And we know that there was an enormous amount of collaboration between the German Nazis and Ukrainian Nazis and Ukrainian auxiliary police and others. There's no denying that. And I've said that over and over and over again. But whatever you think of 2014, and remember, I represented the former president of the Ukraine. I was one of his lawyers. His name was Kuchma. And I went to Kiev and defended him. And I have friends, legal friends, political friends, business friends in Ukraine. And it is not today a place of Nazism. The hero of Ukraine today is Zelensky. He's not a hero because he's a Jew. Maybe he's a hero despite the fact that he's a Jew, but he's a hero. And this most recent election was not a coup. This most recent election, Zelensky won overwhelmingly. It wasn't even close. And he would win today even more overwhelmingly. Again, he didn't win because he was a Jew. He didn't win because he was a Nazi. Obviously, he's not. He may have won for all the wrong reasons. He was a great entertainer. He was on Dancing with the Stars. He went blindfolded in Dancing with the Stars. He sang songs. Ronald Reagan turned out to be a very good president as an entertainer. Of course, he was the governor of California before that. Donald Trump was an entertainer. You make your own decision about whether he was a good president or not. But Zelensky is not the first entertainer ever to be elected president of a country, of a democracy. But he was elected. And you cannot say, I'm not arguing that proves there aren't Nazis in Ukraine. It proves that it is not a Nazi government, that you don't invade Ukraine for purposes of getting rid of a Nazi regime who is headed by a president who was Jewish. And by the way, the previous prime minister before this one was also Jewish. And it seems to me that finally in Ukraine, after many hundreds of years of the most primitive racist anti-Semitism, may have grown out of it, at least for the vast majority of people. And maybe being a Jew today in the Ukraine is not even a factor one way or the other. I'm sure it's a factor among old people. I think I mentioned the other day, I saw somebody interviewed on CNN. CNN did a terrible job because they didn't even question him. He said that Putin is much worse than Hitler because what Hitler did, he did for the benefit of the German people. What, he killed 6 million Jews for the benefit of the German people, whereas what Putin is doing, he's done only for himself. And there wasn't even a pushback. The reporter didn't even, whether she even acknowledged what he was saying, but she just, shook her head and talked about what a brave, great man this one was, because you can't say anything negative today about anybody in the Ukraine. So I'm not of that school. You can say negative things about Ukrainians. You can look into whether or not anything anybody has done might be a war crime. We have to apply neutral principles. But I do not think anybody reasonable could justify the invasion of a sovereign democracy, a democracy who had fair elections and elected Zelensky and elected other people to the parliament. You cannot justify the invasion of that country as an effort to undo Nazism or to get rid of a regime of Nazis. And so Putin is just dead wrong, and those people who are trying to defend him, I think, are dead wrong. There's a lot you can say about the complexity of this issue. Should Ukraine have ever been given some indication that maybe it might be allowed into NATO? Should Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have been invited into NATO? My own views is no. I think that was a provocation, but that doesn't justify the invasion. Do Democratic presidents and Republican presidents share blame for What's going on? Yeah, Natan Sharansky, in a series of articles recently, said that at least some of the blame was on the shoulders of President Obama when he declared that there was a red line in Syria and that he would attack militarily if there was any proof that the Syrian government was using chemical weapons against its citizens. And then when the proof emerged, Obama said, whoops, sorry. No, I didn't mean it. I changed my mind. Uh, but there's been a lot of that by American presidents of both parties. But the blame game is not appropriate at this point in time. At this point in time, we have to use all our resources to protect the innocent people of Ukraine and to try to stop the invasion and the bloodletting that's going on now. So please keep tuning in to the Dershow. I'll be back tomorrow. Write to me. Give me your letters and views. I will read them as I have, even though I disagree with them. And you can also see me on Locals if you want to become a subscriber there.
Live stream.
And so on Thursday, we're going to be also having a live Locals, and I'll give you more information about that tomorrow. See you tomorrow.